All right, so we're going to look now in this this module about the civil rights movements, and we're going to start here with really the beginnings of how this movement started, and we're going to talk about its decline and about then how Black Power kind of moves in to the movement. And this is really running from about 1941 through the late 1960s. So kind of keep that in mind that we're kind of be backtracking a little bit as we set the stage for this civil rights movement. Now, just so you understand what we're really talking about here, it comes up a lot, you know, when we like celebrate Martin Luther King and we say, oh, the civil rights movement, what is civil rights? Now, we need to define it kind of, you know, very precisely. It is a struggle for social justice that mainly takes place from the 1950s to the 1960s for Black Americans to gain equal rights under the law and for those rights to actually be enforced. So that is what, when we say the civil rights movement, that's what we're talking about. Late 1950s through the 60s, predominantly in the South, to have Black Americans gain equal rights and actually have them enforced. That's the civil rights movement. That's what is known as the classical civil rights era, okay? Now, in recent scholarship, there's been a lot of discussion on whether that classic era is really all there is to the civil rights movement. Even though it's really what has been taught that way, we know that it really dates back all the way to the 40s and that the civil rights, fight for civil rights, continued long into the 70s, 80s, and really some would say even into today. But we're talking about the 50s and 60s. It took into account things like police brutality and segregation and all of these things that needed to be figured out. And so it's really this push towards getting everything that an American is supposed to enjoy and be able to have as an American. This movement is, you know, vitally important to bringing that to fruition. And so we're going to give it a quick view. So the Union victory in the Civil War kind of ends slavery, and it leads to the passage of 3 amendments, right? The 13th Amendment that ends slavery, the 14th Amendment that gives equal protection under the law to all citizens, and the 15th Amendment that gives voting rights, which we've talked about all of these. But when you get to the Reconstruction period, we know that it came to an end under kind of bad circumstances, and essentially at the end of it, Jim Crow is established in the South. And you have things like grandfather clauses and literacy tests and all these things that are going to keep African Americans from being able to vote. And it's essentially going to make sure that although in the Constitution they have equal rights, they're not in reality given those rights or able to use those rights. And so that's kind of where we're at. And it stays that way from basically 1868 to the 1960s, that you have segregation and Jim Crow laws that are keeping Black Americans from having their rights. Now, when you get to FDR, and at the beginning of World War II, FDR is going to issue something called Executive Order 8802. This is issued after thousands of African Americans threatened to march on Washington, D.C. Because they're being discriminated against in federal jobs. And they're saying, we understand that this is happening in the South, you know, these people, they're racist and all this stuff. But the federal government should be under the control of the Constitution. And even in federal jobs, we're still being segregated against. That's not right. FDR looks at it and says, you know what, you're correct. There's no reason that segregation should be happening in federal jobs because of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. And so he passes this executive order that opens up defense and other government jobs to people of any race, okay? And so, of course, this really has to do with the idea that you're going to need a lot more workers building things and working in the government during World War II. And so, you know, that's why a lot of people, like I said today, are looking at this and saying, well, that's really the first moment of the civil rights movement. That this executive order and these things that take place in 1941 that are kind of opening the doors for black Americans to start saying, hey, we've got equal rights here, but not here, right? And we should fight for them all over the country. That's really where it starts. But again, the classical era is from the late 50s through the 60s, okay? That's going to be a test question. What is the classical era? What is the classical civil rights movement? Late 50s through the 60s, okay? And so the core of the movement is much later, but it really has its kind of origin points, its roots in this point, all right? So it's really baby steps towards a real movement. During World War II, obviously, African Americans are still going to be dealing with discrimination and segregation. In fact, in the Army, they're going to be put into their own military units. We talked about a couple of them that are extremely effective, like the Tuskegee Airmen, who earned over 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses. And they showed how incredible they were and how brave they were and how much they were patriotic. And they were just as good as any of the white soldiers that they were serving with. In some cases, they were a lot better. But then after they come home from fighting for freedom in Europe and to oppose tyranny in Nazi Germany, they come home and face the same old problems that they always had, which you have to imagine was pretty demoralizing to them. But it shows this stark contrast and exposes in a very obvious way a lot of the hypocrisy that is going on at the time. That, hey, you can go fight for democracy and freedom and American ideals in Europe, but we're not going to give them to you at home, okay? And so that brings us, again, to another executive order. And this one is going to be issued by President Truman as part of his civil rights agenda. People are starting to have a bit more sympathy for the plight of African Americans on these topics. And Truman issues Executive Order 9981, which is going to completely end discrimination in the military based on race. Not gender, but race. So prior to this, you know, black Americans were in segregated units, and basically this is going to bring them back, bring black and white Americans into the same military units, and you know, black Americans weren't allowed to be, you know, advanced through the military ranks in the same way that white Americans were and soldiers were, and that's going to bring it into that. And definitely because it was important for the United States to try and do this now, because once you get to the Cold War, right after World War II, you kind of jump into the Cold War, and American democracy is being compared with Soviet communism. Now, you go, well, why does that matter? Why do we have a fight for civil rights? Well, the communists found that this idea of segregating people was very racist, and that type of racism doesn't exist in communism. So the Soviets are sitting here going like, oh, who are you to tell us that we should be free and have all these freedoms and that democracy is better? You don't even treat all your people the same. And the whole idea of communism is that everybody's the same. There's no segregation. There's no racism in communism. Everybody is just as important as everybody else. And so the U.S. government is starting to kind of look bad because they're allowing this segregation, these things to take place, and the Soviets are using that as propaganda against democracy. And we talked about it in the Cold War. The whole thing is trying to prevent the spread of communism. Well, you're kind of giving them ammunition for their guns by having these racist and segregated aspects of your society. And so, you know, there is a big effort by the government and by some major leaders in industry and stuff to show, like, no, democracy and capitalism is good. Look, we're going to treat black people better. It's about this time you have people like Jackie Robinson, who becomes the second black player to ever play in the major leagues. I know I said second. Did y'all know that? He wasn't the first. Yeah. No, I know. He was the first one that played in the major leagues after the color barrier was put in place, but not the first to ever play. There's actually a man, Moses Fleet Walker, who played on Toledo, their major league team, and that was like 1886 or 1883. He actually played in the major leagues professionally and was paid. amongst white players. And then the color barrier was put in place. And another black player does not play until Jackie Robinson. So although he is the first after the color barrier, he was not the first black player to play Major League Baseball, as you have been told your entire life. So there you go. You know me, Coach Redmond, tearing down American heroes.
Why don't we celebrate
Fleet Walker? I don't know why. He's been lost to time for some reason.
just not that good?
You know, he was great. He played in the major leagues. And so, obviously, this is going to lead to the idea of some cultural shifts. But Jackie Robinson is going to have some major, major problems that he's going to face also, clearly. And those are very well documented, some of the issues that he's going to face. Now, also keep those things in mind for the background. Let's talk about, the first steps to kind of actually move forward. And one of the first major battlegrounds that this is going to take place in is the schools. And if you have segregated schools, you're going to have basically all aspects of your society are going to remain segregated and racist. So the NAACP is going to actually try and overturn a previous court case from 1896 called Plessy v. Ferguson. Okay, now Plessy versus Ferguson was a court case that established the idea of separate but equal. It essentially institutionalized segregation and racism and said it's okay if you segregate people by race as long as they have access to equal facilities, particularly in education. And so Plessy v. Ferguson was the law of the land. It was the reason that the South had been able to segregate their societies. And it had been passed by the Supreme Court in one of the most unbelievably racist and terrible court cases ever. But by the time you get to the 50s and 60s, you have the NAACP led by a guy named Thurgood Marshall, who is actually going to sue public schools all across the South in an attempt to end segregation. And basically, try and use the reintegration of schools to basically bring an end to Jim Crow as a whole. Okay? Jim Crow laws were extremely ingrained, and this whole idea of being separate but equal was a joke. I mean, it was an absolute joke. White teachers were paid more. They were supplied with better books. Their schools were in better shape. Typically, there were more white schools in a particular area than black schools. You might have one black school that served an entire county, say in Alabama, while that county would have 10 white schools. Well, the result of that would be that black students would have to travel sometimes an hour or 2 hours to their schools, while white students might have one right down the street from them. And so there was actually, they found that states usually spent anywhere between 10 to 20 times the amount of money on educating white students than black students. And again, Thurgood Marshall goes and sues, and he decides he's going to try and overturn this. Now, we fast forward a little bit, and you end up with the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education. And in this Supreme Court case, they finally decide to overrule Plessy v. Ferguson and say that, hey, separate is not equal. In fact, that separate is inherently unequal, and that it can no longer be the law of the land. The verdict was unanimous against segregation now. They said that, you could no longer continue segregating them by race. Here's the problem. He says, hey, schools, you're going to have to integrate now as soon as possible. And then left it at that. Now, what's the problem with that? There's zero enforcement. There's no time frame. He said, just integrate when you can. which means that the Supreme Court didn't really want to force integration. They just wanted to say that integration was necessary, that segregation was wrong. So you need to integrate when you get a chance. Well, the South was like, we hadn't got a chance yet for like 15 years. Right? And so basically, you know, in the North and in border states, they integrate. In the South, they basically go, we're not going to. You know, oh, we don't have enough money to integrate. We'd have to build a whole new school. We'd have to raise taxes. It's going to take a while, you know. And so there's no real speed to this. In fact, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education in 1964, fewer than 10% of Southern schools had actually integrated. Some areas actually managed 0% compliance. They just ignored it and kept doing whatever they wanted because what are you going to do about it? And the Supreme Court, as we said, did not address anything like separate restrooms or buses or hotels. So Jim Crow, they were looking at it and going, well, looks like our Jim Crow laws aren't really under threat. We don't have to integrate anything. They just said that school has to be integrated. They didn't tell us when. They didn't say anything about any of the other things. So they basically find this loophole that say, hey, you know, we don't actually have to change anything. But it was a big idea, and it was a big win legally. But now the people started to realize that if they were going to get their equal rights that had been given to them lawfully, they were probably going to have to fight for those one way or another. That brings us to a very famous incident, Rosa Parks. Now, Rosa Parks becomes sort of inadvertent, accidental icon of the movement. You know, everybody thinks, you know, you probably have some preconceived notions about Rosa Parks, that, you know, she's just this old lady who gets on the bus and she's too tired, and so she sits at the front, and then, you know, she just happened to be somebody that they tell her to move, and she says, I'm not going to move, I'm too tired, and then she gets arrested, and then everybody's like, oh, this poor old lady who had nothing to do with any of this stuff was just tired and got kicked off the bus, and then that's how the civil rights. How many of you have heard that story? Yes, more or less, yes? Okay, most of that is not true. Most of that is simply not an accurate representation of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an activist. She was very involved in pushing against Jim Crow laws. She was tired and she was working, but she was actually sitting in the black section of the bus. The white section was at the front, then you had the black section at the back. Rosa Parks took her seat. She got on the bus after work and sat down in the black section. Did y'all know that? Everybody thought, oh yeah, she was in the white section. No, she wasn't. She was in the black section. Here's what the rule was, though. Even if you're in the black section and the white section fills up, and then another white person gets on the bus and asks you to move, even though you're in the black section, you still have to get up and move. So it wasn't this idea of like, I'm going to sit in the white section and just show them I'm not moving. No, she was lawfully sitting where she was supposed to sit. What happened was they overfilled the white section. They said, hey, you got to move. She said, I'm not moving. I'm sitting in the black section where I'm supposed to sit. You can sit in another seat. I'm supposed to sit here. I'm in the black section. And that's when they arrested her. You know, and so, like I said, it's very kind of, the story is not necessarily always relayed that way. But she was also, like I said, she was involved in some of these organizations that were pushing for freedoms and for civil rights. And so she kind of becomes the inadvertent mother of the movement. She didn't get on the bus saying, I'm going to boycott, but she did boycott to some extent. This begins the Montgomery bus boycott. That is led by a young Baptist preacher by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr. comes in and he gets people from the African American community to decide we are not going to ride the buses anymore until they get rid of the white and black sections. And he kind of becomes the father of the civil rights movement as we know it, at least the classical civil rights movement. Again, classical civil rights movement as we kind of know it. There are far more people involved, far different ways to examine this movement, very, very important ways. But in terms of what is kind of the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement, these are kind of the leaders of that. Huh? Right. So Martin Luther King was at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He's inspired by David Thoreau and Gandhi and the Bible, and Gandhi especially. That's where they kind of get the idea of the nonviolence, the civil disobedience kind of idea, as opposed to fighting and going to war for your rights and taking them by force, to take them by nonviolence. And it becomes a major aspect of the civil rights movement. Peaceful civil disobedience. So, and so these guys are very, very integral in boycotting the Montgomery buses, and they begin to boycott on December 5th, and they arrest King and this guy Abernathy, who kind of organized it. They arrest him, and they start to violently try to break up these protests. They bomb 4 churches as well as the homes of King and Abernathy. They literally threw bombs through the windows and blew them up. And so, but the boycott continued. And through this time, King and Abernathy, they're hoping that, 30 to 40% of African Americans in Montgomery would participate in this. They think if we can get 30 to 40% of African Americans to stop taking the buses, maybe that will hurt them enough that they'll listen to us. 99% of African Americans in Montgomery participated in the bus boycott. 99%. Now, because they're a poorer community and they lived in the urban areas, the vast majority of the people who rode the Montgomery buses were African Americans. So when all of them essentially stop riding the bus companies begin losing money at an astronomical rate. It takes almost a full year to November 23rd of 1950 when 6 Supreme Court justices actually rule in favor of desegregating buses and rule that it's unconstitutional for city officials to segregate something that is paid for by taxes from everyone. Basically, you can't charge taxes to white and black people, use it to run the buses, and then segregate them. So government-funded facilities are now going to be desegregated, and services. And it is only after that that the community of Montgomery reluctantly desegregates their buses and the Montgomery bus boycott ends. They had held firm, and despite all their attacks that had gone against them, they had won this fight. But this is going to trigger a firestorm across the South. They are going to be very, very angry. And other areas are going to kind of say, hey, this worked in Montgomery, and you're going to see bus boycotts all around the South, some of them being successful, some of them ending in massive violence, which we'll talk about as we kind of move through this. The next major incident that's going to take place is called the Little Rock Nine, and that's going to take place in 1957. It was based at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, which asked for volunteers from all black high schools to attend a formerly segregated school, Central High School. And they're basically saying, hey, our doors are open, but we need some of you to come here. So the school board was kind of progressive. The town was not. So the school board says, we'll integrate Central High School, and everybody that goes to Central High School is like, no, you're not. Well, 9 students are chosen. These 9 students were some of the 9 of the highest performing students in all of the black schools in Little Rock. And they begin to try and go to class. Now, you have crazy pictures like this, and actually there's one picture not long ago that Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, he got in trouble for no reason whatsoever because he attended Central High School in 1957. He was actually, I think he was in elementary school maybe, junior high kid. And so he went to the high school on the day that the black students arrived and tried to get in. And there's a picture of him like looking at what happened. Everybody's like, see, he's a racist. He didn't want the black kids to go to school with him. And he's like, I was 9. I just went to go see what was going on. Like, but there's a picture of him that you can find where he was identified being at the school the day this happened, which is kind of a crazy piece of history, honestly. Nobody was like, tell us about your experience. They're all like, you're a racist. You should have to sell the Cowboys, which I don't disagree with. Not that he's racist, but I wish he would sell them to somebody who knew what they were doing. But, oh yeah, the Saints doing pretty well? Oh, okay. So, yeah, they try to get in on September 3rd. They arrive there to start classes, but they are actually met by the Arkansas National Guard and the governor. His name was Orville Faubus, which, he basically riled everybody up and put the Arkansas National Guard and said, you are not going to school here. He was trying to prevent them from going to school. He had guns and pointed them at their face, and there was a screaming mob. And, this lady right here, like, she's probably real proud of how she was acting as she, like, yelled racial slurs at this poor 9th grade girl. It's absolutely ridiculous. But they kept trying to go back, going back, and eventually they got in and were able to go to school there because President Eisenhower actually says, hey, you can't use the Arkansas National Guard to prevent them from integrating the schools, and he activates he puts the National Guard under federal control and says, instead of keeping them from going, you're to follow them everywhere and make sure nobody prevents them from going to school. And so this becomes a major step towards desegregation in the South as well. Last slide, one more slide here for this lecture, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and then we'll get into the big stuff in the 60s as a consequence of this in the next one. But Eisenhower is going to pressure Congress to pass this law that's ultimately going to culminate in what we call the Civil Rights Act of 1957. We're very creative with the names of our bills. They're like, what is this bill going to do? It's going to give civil rights. And they're like, we'll call it the Civil Rights Act. And they're like, I think we already have one of those. And they were like, oh, crap, what year was that one? Oh, this one's in 1957, so can't we just call it the Civil Rights of 1957? They're like, yeah, that's totally different. Good call. And then so we named it that. And essentially, although all Americans had gained the right to vote, many southern states made it difficult for black citizens to do so. They required prospective voters to take literacy tests that were confusing and misleading, nearly impossible to pass. And we're actually going to take one of those tests as a class, and we're going to see if you'd be able to vote in Alabama in the 1950s. We're going to take a sample of the literacy test, an actual one that was handed out, like when you went to go register at the registrar's office to vote. If you were white, you got one test, and if you were black, you were handed another test. And so we have a copy of one of those tests. I'm going to give it to you, and we're going to see if you'd be able to vote. Remember, you have to get every question correct.
Do we have a white or a black test?
You're going to have a black test. The white test was, what's your name? Are you white? Say your ABCs. You can read. Good. Let's do it. All right. So Congress basically puts this into law. It says that the federal government is going to prosecute anyone who tries to prevent someone from voting. And so basically it's trying to outlaw literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and all of this stuff. And again, though, the problem is that it doesn't really give a way to actually enforce this. If you get a report out, and they go and investigate and find out that you're personally keeping people, you could be prosecuted, but they're not going to prosecute the entire town, right? So all you have to do is, like, if it gets reported and then they investigate, you got a problem. So, but it's just one more small step towards civil rights.